Good evening to everyone. My name is Nancy Horowitz, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program on behalf of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies and on behalf of the minor in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. Just a few words about the minor in our program. It began a few years ago with the help of a steering committee that was comprised of faculty in quite a few different fields who had all been teaching and researching Holocaust studies, genocide studies, and human rights. We began this minor in order to offer our students a focused opportunity to study in depth some of the most crucial events in history and to learn about causes, consequences, and legacies of those histories. The causes are very important. For example, students learn about the impact of extreme nationalism and how racism and prejudice can be spread through the media. We also discuss international human rights laws as a way to combat genocide and other violations of human rights. In addition to the undergraduate minor, we offer a graduate certificate that's available to students who are currently getting their graduate degrees in other fields. Our talk this evening is part of a new series, Encounters in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. The event this evening is the first this academic year, and we have others planned for next semester, including an event on January 31st as part of International Holocaust Commemoration Day. It will be the screening of a new documentary on the Vatican and the Holocaust entitled Holy Silence. More information about that event will be forthcoming, but please do mark your calendars. At this point, I would like to turn over the introductions for tonight's event to Dr. Sultan Dugan. Dr. Dugan is a postdoctoral fellow at the Elie Wiesel Center, and she is the co-coordinator of the Encounters Speaker Series. Her research is concerned with the question of citizenship and religious minorities in Germany after the Holocaust. During this semester, she's teaching a course on memorials and human rights after mass violence, focusing on post-Holocaust Europe and on post-slavery United States. I will now turn the introductions over to her.
All right. Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everyone. So I would like to introduce our speaker and our moderator for tonight. Our speaker, Benjamin Madley, is Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. His work engages Native America, the United States, and colonialism in world history. He earned a BA in history at Yale University in 1994. He attended Oxford University as a Henry Fellow and earned his master's in history there in 1995. He joined the history department of UCLA in 2012, and today he will present from his latest book, An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. The book has won many prizes. I'm not going to mention all of them, but I want to mention that it is also the winner of the Raphael Lemkin Book Award from the Institute for the Study of Genocide. So we are very excited to have Professor Madley with us tonight. I also want to introduce our moderator, Professor Longman. Tim Longman is full professor of political science and international relations in the Pardee School at Boston University. He's an expert on the Rwandan genocide and the aftermath of the question on truth and reconciliation. He also is the director of CURA, the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, and the acting director for in the African Studies Center. We thank Professor Longman for leading through the discussion after the talk. So, thank you, everyone.
Let me just mention for people, as you have questions, if you'll notice on your screen at the edge, there is a Q&A box. So if you have questions for our speaker, please put them in there. We also, after he's done talking, can call on individuals and you can come on screen and ask your question. We just have to let you in. So Professor Madley.
Thank you very much, Tim. I appreciate it. So I want to make a few prefatory remarks before we begin. First of all, I'd like everyone to know this evening that my presentation is not going to be easy ground to traverse. This is very difficult material. And so if at any point you feel that you need to step away and get a breath of fresh air, or if you've just had enough, that's perfectly fine. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that I'm here in Los Angeles on Tongva Gabrielino land, the ancient, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tongva people. And while we're on that night, I just want to remind you that wherever you are in the United States, you're on someone's ancient and ancestral territory. In fact, everywhere you go in this hemisphere, from the shores of the Arctic Ocean in the north to the tip of Patagonia in the south, you'll be in Indian country, on American Indian land. Now I'd like to begin my presentation, so I'm going to take a moment to share my screen with you. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the celebrants moved together in ancient rhythms, the women's clamshell necklaces clinking softly against their seashell dresses. Male dancers, attired as birds, deer, or hunters, supported the females in their heavy regalia. Meanwhile, singers raised their voices heavenward in the ancient songs of Nidash, or the feather dance. Between songs, the singers stopped to offer prayers of thanks, not only for the original creation of this beautiful world in which we are privileged to live, but also for its renewal in each and every moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away under a full moon. Nearby, they passed through small round doorways into snug redwood plank houses with gently sloping roofs. Outside, Lake Earl lapped gently at the shore. Inside, the Tolowa and their California and Oregon Indian guests slept near kith and kin. The celebrants were unaware that Crescent City men less than 7 miles away had established their own branch of California's expanding killing machine. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by California Governor John Bigler. He had provided them with 20 muskets, 95 rifles, swords, cutlasses, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They now prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill Indian people. In the pre-dawn hours of December 31st, 1854, as many as 116 militiamen, accompanied by an unknown number of auxiliaries, quietly surrounded the village and took up positions hidden inside brush, behind sand dunes, or within the shadows of boulders. At daybreak, as women, men, and children emerged to begin the day, the militiamen and vigilantes opened fire. They shot them down just as fast as they could reload. Possessing only 3 guns, the Indian people gathered there that morning were unable to defend themselves. A few plunged into the nearby waters of Lake Earl. There too they became targets, while those who swam across the lake encountered a group of sharpshooters laying in wait. When the firing ceased, perhaps hundreds of people were dead. Not more than 5 seemed to have survived. The attackers suffered a single casualty, and the state of California later paid the militiamen for their work. This massacre was part of an emerging American genocide. Between the years 1846 and 1870, California's Indian population plunged from perhaps 150,000 to not more than 30,000 survivors. Diseases, dislocation, and starvation caused many of these deaths. However, abduction, unfree labor, mass death on federal Indian reservations, homicides, battles, and more than 300 separate massacres also took many thousands of lives while hindering reproduction. This was, in fact, a case of genocide. So what do I mean when I use this freighted, explosive term? For a prosecutor in an international court of law to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they have to prove 2 things. First, they have to demonstrate to the court beyond any reasonable shadow of doubt that the defendant demonstrated intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. International legal scholars call this special intent. But beyond demonstrating merely special intent, the prosecutor must also prove that the defendant committed one of the 5 genocidal crimes enumerated here. This is the definition that I will use this evening, and it is the definition that I use in all of my work addressing the question of genocide in human history. Now, following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began to re-examine the colonization of California by the United States. And by the year 2000, more than 20 different scholars had deemed that what happened here was, in fact, a case of genocide. Still, relatively little has been written about this genocide compared to more canonical cases such as the Holocaust, Rwanda, or the Armenian genocide. Building on previous scholarship, my book, An American Genocide, is the first systematic and comprehensive recounting of genocide in California between 1846 and 1873. This topic calls for meticulous analysis because the stakes are so high, not only for scholars like myself, but for California Indian people and for all people living in the United States. If US citizens founded some regions of California, if not the state as a whole, on deliberate attempts to annihilate California Indians, scholars will need to reevaluate current interpretive axioms and address new questions about the state's history. Scholars could, for example, re-examine the widespread assumption that the indirect effects of colonization, like epidemic diseases, rather than deliberate actions like mass murder, were the leading cause of death in encounters between newcomers and native Californians. Exceptionalist interpretations of United States history lose validity as researchers compare California to other mass killings around the globe. A careful study of genocide in California will also help scholars to re-examine the larger hemispheric indigenous population catastrophe. The genocide question is particularly urgent for California's approximately 150,000 people of California Indian ancestry. Should they press for government apologies, reparations, or control of land where genocidal events took place? Will tribes be able to successfully marshal evidence of genocide in cases involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition? How should they commemorate victims of mass murder while also emphasizing accommodation, resistance, survival, and 21st century cultural renewal? The psychological issues are likewise fraught. What happens when a tribal citizen learns that she is the descendant of both a genocide perpetrator and a genocide victim? How might California Indian people reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, sometimes at the hands of agents of the United States, with their often intense patriotism? Finally, what role might acknowledgement of genocide have on the intergenerational historical trauma so prevalent in many California Indian communities, and that trauma's direct connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and extraordinarily high rates of youth suicide? The question of genocide in California under US rule also poses explosive questions for all United States citizens. Should government officials tender public apologies, as Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush did in the 1980s for the forcible relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War? Should federal officials offer compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress paid to more than 82,000 of these Japanese Americans and their heirs? Might California officials decrease their cut of California Indians' more than $8 billion a year in annual gaming revenue as a way of paying reparations? A better understanding of the California genocide might also impact the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian communities currently seeking official federal recognition. The question of commemoration is closely linked. Will non-Indians support or tolerate the public commemoration of mass murders committed by some of this state's forefathers with the same kinds of monuments, museums, and state legislated days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in public school curricula or public discourse? These questions are extremely important, but can only be addressed in limited ways without a comprehensive understanding of relations between California Indians and newcomers between 1846 and 1873. Sporadic mass killings of California Indian people punctuated the initial years of US rule in California. But James Marshall's 1848 gold strike precipitated a local genocide. Oregon men, like this man here, played a leading role in increasing violence against California Indians. They rarely had connections to California's existing Mexican economy and society, in which indigenous people played important roles. And many of these Oregonians saw Indian people as little more than dangerous obstacles to the rapid acquisition of wealth. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indians increased in both frequency and lethality, particularly in the central mines. One 49er explained in a journal entry, Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and they did shoot them freely. That April, a miner named Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide, Coloma, at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall had first found gold. In the central mines, Johnson and others recounted multiple massacres, scalpings, beheadings, and the slaying of surrendered California Indian people. Due to spotty primary source coverage, there were not yet any newspapers in the region. We will never know the exact number of California Indian people murdered by whites in and around the mines in 1849 and early 1850. But hundreds, if not thousands, may have suffered violent deaths there. What was clear to eyewitness observers was the exterminatory nature of such killings, both in their intent and in their demographic impact. In December of 1849, Pomo and Wapo Indian people, held as unfree laborers, rose up and killed their two white captors near Clear Lake, at a place now known as Kelseyville. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and regular United States Army soldiers killed as many as 1,000 California Indian people, or more, between Christmas 1849 and May 15, 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers in Napa and Sonoma valleys. Then, after authorities arrested some of these vigilantes, California's new state Supreme Court, in its very first trial, let all 8 men go on bail. Meanwhile, the United States Army also sought to avenge the deaths of the 2 white ranchers. In a San Francisco newspaper article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one journalist described a massacre committed by the United States Army on Clear Lake, using information provided by a regular U.S. Army captain, and I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither age nor sex were spared. It was the order of extermination fearfully obeyed," end quote. As many as 800 Northern California Indian people died that day, drowned, beaten to death, shot, or bayoneted. Other killings followed, and all of the officers involved received promotions. 3 became regular United States Army generals. 1 was later elected governor of the state of California. A new factor was at work: large-scale extended vigilante and U.S. Army killing campaigns tolerated by both state and federal authorities. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into the state. Before the gold rush, there were not more than 13 or 14,000 non-Indians in California. 1860 census takers counted over 360,000. They came primarily in search of wealth, but in seeking to access gold, eat, dress, acquire labor, and satisfy their sexual desires, immigrants placed immense pressure on California Indians. These demands triggered an explosion of ranching, hunting, mining, and slave raiding. These activities generated shockwaves that had devastating impacts on California Indians. California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under martial law, U.S. military officers made California Indians second-class subjects with few rights. California's 1849 Constitution then made it nearly impossible for Indians to vote. And in 1850, California's first legislature banned all Indians from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from giving evidence for or against whites in criminal cases, and banned Indians from serving as jurors. They later barred Indians from working as attorneys. So in combination, these laws largely shut California Indians out of participation in and protection by the state legal system. Abduction played a major role in California's population decline. In 1850, legislators passed what they called an Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing California courts and juries to summarily reject Indian testimony. Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work on trumped-up charges. We see here an advertisement that I found in the archives, which reads in French, 16-year-old Southern California Indian female at the price of a pound of gunpowder and a bottle of brandy. 10 years later, in 1860, legislators extended the 1850 Act to legalize indenture of any Indians. These laws triggered a boom in violent kidnappings while separating women and men during peak reproductive years, both of which acted to accelerate California Indian population decline. Some California Indian people were treated as disposable unfree laborers. One lawyer recalled that, I quote, "Los Angeles had its weekly Monday morning slave mart, and thousands of honest, useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way." Indeed, between 1850 and 1870, LA's Indian population fell from 3,693 to 219. Escape was one way that California Indians defied servitude, but whites often responded with lethal force. The Lasik Wailaki Indian woman Lucy Young, pictured here, escaped servitude multiple times. She recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver, front skin hang down like apron, she tie up with cotton dress, never die neither," end quote. Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled with her master's Indian boy in 1858, vigilantes responded by massacring 15 people, her entire village. 2 years later, a rancher became so incensed after his 7-year-old California Indian servant visited his family half a mile away that he, quote, "slaughtered the whole family, about 6 persons, boy and all." Despite such reports, which appeared with alarming frequency in California newspapers, policymakers failed to intervene, while almost all law enforcement officials turned a blind eye. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, federal agents signed 18 treaties with 119 California tribes, allocating them 7,488,000 acres. Those are on this map, the dark gray areas that you see surrounded by light gray areas. However, United States senators repudiated all of these treaties. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized only 5 temporary military reservations, not exceeding 25,000 acres each. The establishment of California's state militia system now marked the rise of a killing machine. Between 1850 and 1861, 3,414 militiamen enrolled in 24 separate volunteer militia expeditions, killing at least 1,342 California Indians. However, their impact transcended these numbers. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating an unofficial grant of legal impunity for such killing, while inspiring many more vigilante murders. Indeed, vigilantes killed more than 6,400 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. In January of 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, quote, oh, sorry about that, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement that the state now funded. The following month, state legislators voted to borrow $500,000, an extraordinary amount of money at the time, for past and future Indian militia hunting operations. Meanwhile, the state began building an arsenal of arms donated by the United States Army. Then, in 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who became California's governor in 1858, told his fellow U.S. senators that California Indians, and I quote, will be exterminated, insisting that, and I quote, the interest of the white man demands their extinction, end quote. That same year, state legislators passed a $600,000 bond measure to support additional militia operations, even as vigilante killings continued. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, provided a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place in the 1850s. Bell remembered, and I quote, about 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister and cut her heart out and threw it in the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands, end quote. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian. The United States Congress endorsed such killing, even as state and federal leaders perfected the killing machine. In 1854, Congress allocated over $924,000 to reimburse California for its past militia campaigns. The following year, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William C. Kibbe, who we see here, and who ran California's militia system from 1852 through 1863, underscored the militia's genocidal purpose. There are but two alternatives before us, he proclaimed, either to wage a war of extermination or abandon a large and productive territory, end quote. To help perfect his killing machine, Kibbe wrote a tactical manual and distributed it to his militia officers. Meanwhile, Secretary of War Jefferson C. Davis sent Kibbe United States Army tactical manuals to distribute to his militiamen. Then, in 1857, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in 1861, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to pay for additional California militia expeditions. Civilians and officials also carried out large forced removal operations to concentrate surviving California Indians on federal reservations. For example, in 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 Indian people while forcibly removing one group to the Mendocino Reservation. As one California Indian man remembered, and I quote, when they took the Indians to Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock. They shot the old people who couldn't make the trip. They would shoot children for getting tired. Once at reservations, California Indians often encountered institutionalized malnutrition and lethal starvation. The Concow leader Tomayanem recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to Mendocino Reservation, we were very hungry and the concows began to die very fast. Other reservations proved little better. In about 1860, Tomayanem and his people relocated to Round Valley Reservation. There, in 1860, officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Indians. By 1862, daily rations there had fallen to not more than 390 calories per working person per day. If some California reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, malnutrition weakened the immune systems of others, making them more susceptible to lethal diseases. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing miscarriages and stillbirths. Federal employees also killed large numbers of California Indian people more directly. During the U.S. Civil War, 15,725 California men enlisted in the Union Army. Thousands of them remained in California and soon transformed California's killing machine. As U.S. troops, these so-called California volunteers replaced relatively small, short-term militia campaigns with larger, longer army operations. The Army now fielded the most sustained military campaigns ever seen in California. Vigilante operations flourished alongside them, but the genocide was now primarily a federal project. And the United States Army killed substantial numbers. Hundreds would die in campaigns led by officers like this man pictured here, Colonel Henry M. Black. California volunteers also killed prisoners en masse on multiple occasions. Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how, in 1863, and I quote, "I had all the bucks collected together and 35 were either shot or sabered. None escaped." The United States Army continued killing California Indian people through the late 1860s. Even after officers concluded their last large-scale operation, the 1872-1873 Modoc War, they hanged and then beheaded 4 surrendered Modoc prisoners before shipping their heads to a collection in Washington, D.C. The California Indian catastrophe fits the 2-part legal definition set forth in the UN Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated in word and deed their intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed all 5 of the genocidal acts listed in the convention. Killing members of the group occurred in more than 370 massacres, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that from 1846 to 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and regular U.S. soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indians, and probably many more. By way of contrast, California Indians killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indians during this period. Other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policies of demolishing California Indian villages and their food stores while driving survivors into inhospitable mountain and desert regions amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Some U.S. Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal reservations in California committed the same crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lower fertility while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal decision makers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, professional slave raiders, and federal officials were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced transfers. By breaking up families and shattering communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence exists to designate the California Indian catastrophe a case of genocide. Elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. Legislators created a legal environment in which California Indians had almost no rights. They then went on to build and fund a killing machine. The US Army also played a crucial role in this genocide, first creating the exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents, helping to build the killing machine, participating in killing, and finally taking control. In total, US Army soldiers killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. But if state legislators were the architects of genocide, federal officials helped to lay the groundwork. They became the final arbiters of the design, and ultimately they paid for most of the official killing. Like California Indians, Native American people across the country suffered a devastating population decline following the arrival of newcomers. Before contact, perhaps 5 million or more indigenous people inhabited what is now the continental United States. By the year 1900, census takers counted fewer than 250,000 survivors. Scholars have written about genocide in the United States, but much of that work has been polarized by the American genocide debate. The direct and deliberate killing of Indians in California between 1846 and 1873 was more lethal and sustained than anywhere else in the United States or in its colonial antecedents. Yet there remains a need for additional detailed studies addressing other regions and peoples within and beyond the United States. The variables present in the California genocide did not recur in precisely the same combination or at the same intensities in the histories of other Native American peoples. In some other cases, diseases were the overwhelming cause of mortalities. Both state and federal or colonial and metropolitan decision makers were not complicit in every case. Other American Indian peoples employed different survival and resistance strategies, for example, fleeing contact zones or killing larger numbers of colonizers than California Indians did. Finally, in other cases, colonizers may have committed fewer or no genocidal crimes, while the causes and rates of death differed. We need to build on our existing knowledge with new research in order to understand the full picture for the United States, North America, and the entire Western Hemisphere. However, this book presents a workable methodology for examining potential cases of genocide in the Americas and beyond. The UN Genocide Convention provides us with a standardized, internationally recognized rubric and a coherent legal definition that may be consistently applied. Scholars can rigorously consider every potential case in consistent terms. Just as important, we may consider each on a case-by-case or region-by-region basis, not just in California, but nationwide and internationally, to create a scholarly precision in our use of a politically explosive term, and to seriously evaluate the balance between variables in population decline like disease and the 5 categories of genocidal crimes described in the Genocide Convention. Thus, this book points the field toward clear and consistent definitional standards and application. Detailed case studies are a crucial element of genocide studies because case studies provide a very powerful tool with which to understand genocide and to combat its denial and repetition around the world. Native American people experienced and reacted to conquest and colonization in a wide variety of ways. Rigorously examining this range of cases using the Genocide Convention to evaluate both genocidal intent and genocidal acts will help to move the discussion of genocide in the United States and the Western Hemisphere toward clarity. Unbraiding each region's story from the tapestry of American Indian history and bringing each into sharper relief will create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and of Western Hemisphere history as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they will help all of us, both American Indian and non-Indian, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you.